Manson killer Susan Atkins on getting brainwashed with LSD.
I used to think that you came down off an acid trip after 12 hours. That's not true. When you take acid, you think you're coming back to where you started from. Originally, you don't. And every time you drop acid, you get a little bit further away from reality. And I took so much acid that I just was what I would term spaced. Your concepts of right and wrong. So you step out beyond those bounds, and when you step out beyond those bounds, the imagination begins to take over. And the imagination can be a very deceitful thing. I would take a thesis, writing a book on what LSD can do to the mind.
LSD was a very important factor in the CIA's MKULTRA mind control program. LSD was also a very important factor in Charles Manson's cult, his quote-unquote family. In a previous video I made about Manson and LSD, I explored how Manson used the drug to brainwash his followers. This was such a prominent subject when it came to Manson that it was argued the Manson killers shouldn't get the death penalty because they'd been brainwashed with LSD. Because of the brainwashing, they weren't really in control of their actions, and therefore they shouldn't get the death penalty. This was an actual argument being made in court. That's just a glimpse of how controversial of a subject LSD was when it came to Manson. Of course, Charles Manson and his killers were all sentenced to death. However, their death sentences were changed to life imprisonment when, in 1972, the California Supreme Court found the death penalty to be unconstitutional. For those of you who haven't seen that video I made on LSD and the Manson trials, I will be going over that information in the second half of this video. But first, I want to take a look at MKUltra. MKUltra was an extremely controversial top-secret CIA program which operated from 1953 to 1973. The program violated all sorts of human rights. The objective of MKUltra was to develop mind control techniques to be able to get people to do things without them even realizing what they were doing. The ultimate goal of MKUltra was to be able to take normal, ordinary people and turn them into remorseless killers. The parallel between how MKUltra wanted to achieve this and how Manson did achieve this, how Manson was able to take seemingly normal people and turn them into complete psycho murderers, is very, very stark. Many people believe Manson was part of MKUltra. In search of mind control techniques, MKUltra experimented on people with drugs, specifically LSD. LSD was central to how Manson was able to brainwash his followers. There's a lot of parallels. I am currently in the process of making a longer video which really dives deep into the different ways it appears that Manson was connected to the CIA, including the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, Dr. Jolly West, and more. For this video here, however, I want to take a look at what MKUltra was as a whole. What exactly was MKUltra? Who in the CIA approved of this program? How many people died from these experiments, and what exactly were these experiments? This is the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. In the 1970s, in order to prevent information about MKUltra leaking to the public, the CIA decided to destroy all documents related to the program. However, what the CIA overlooked was that there were thousands of documents related to MKUltra that weren't located at the headquarters. They forgot to destroy those documents. It's a very interesting, controversial history. The following is from Chaos by Tom O'Neill, where he goes over all of this extremely controversial subject matter. Quote, "The CIA, then in its infancy, saw mind control as a natural extension of communism. In 1949, the CIA launched Operation Bluebird, a mind control program that trampled on human rights. The CIA tested drugs on American citizens, most in federal penitentiaries or on military bases, who didn't even know about, let alone consent, to the battery of procedures they underwent. Regardless, in 1952, the CIA found further quote-unquote justification to keep these abuses going. That year, 1952, in Korea, captured American pilots admitted on national radio that they'd sprayed the Korean countryside with illegal biological weapons. It was a confession so beyond the pale that the CIA blamed communists. The POWs must have been brainwashed. That word, brainwashed, didn't appear in English before 1950. It articulated a set of fears that had coalesced in post-war America. Soviets were trying to force an evil philosophy onto the world. Technology had destabilized every atom of human nature, and a new class of chemicals with unpronounceable names could reduce people to machines. Thus, the human mind, like any other appliance, could be rewired and automated. Once the Korean War was over in 1953 and the American POWs returned, The Army brought in a team of scientists to quote-unquote deprogram them. Among those scientists was a young psychiatrist from Cornell, Dr. Louis J. West. He would later claim to have studied 83 prisoners of war, 56 of whom had been forced to make false confessions. West interviewed them at length, undoing the treacheries of the quote-unquote thought reform they'd undergone in enemy hands. Dr. West and his colleagues were credited with reintegrating the POWs into Western society, and maybe more importantly, getting them to renounce their claims about having used biological weapons. Dr. West's success with the POWs gained him entry to the upper echelons of the intelligence community. As the Cold War bred paranoia, the CIA accelerated its mind control efforts, and West, I learned, carved out a niche he'd occupy for decades to come. Initially, the CIA wanted only to prevent further brainwashing by the Soviets, but the extraordinary power of psychotropic drugs, particularly LSD, was hard to ignore. Thus, a defensive program became an offensive one. Operation Bluebird morphed into Operation Artichoke, a search for an all-purpose truth serum. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a poisons expert who headed the chemical division of the CIA's technical services staff, had convinced the agency's director, Allen Dulles, that mind control ops were the future. Gottlieb, whose aptitude and amorality had earned him the nickname the Black Sorcerer, developed gadgetry straight out of a sci-fi. High-potency stink bombs, exploding seashells, poisoned cigars, poisoned anything. Dulles, convinced that the American dream was at stake, ensured that Gottlieb was well-funded. On April 13, 1953, Dulles officially set Project MKUltra into motion. MKUltra's broadest goal was to influence human behavior. Under its umbrella were 149 sub-projects, many involving research that used unwitting participants. Having persuaded an Indianapolis pharmaceutical company to replicate the Swiss formula for LSD, the CIA now had a limitless domestic supply of its favorite new drug. The CIA hoped to produce couriers who could embed hidden messages in their brains, to implant false memories and remove true ones in people without their awareness, to convert groups to opposing ideologies, and more. The loftiest objective was the creation of hypno-programmed assassins. Interestingly, LSD, the same substance that held the promise of controlling minds and quashing communism, was used in CIA office pranks. Agents would quietly slip LSD into their colleagues' drinks to achieve much-needed first-hand knowledge. A plan to spike the punch bowl at the CIA Christmas party was quashed when higher-ups reminded the office that it could cause insanity. Now, the most sensitive work for the MKUltra program was conducted far from CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. It was farmed out to scientists at colleges, hospitals, prisons, and military bases all over the US and Canada. The CIA gave these scientists aliases, funneled money to them, and instructed them on how to conceal their research from prying eyes, including those of their unknowing subjects. Feeling that it was their patriotic duty, the scientists accepted their secret missions in defiance of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. In 1949, at the Nuremberg trials that adjudicated the crimes of World War II, the United States adopted the International Code for Human Experimentation, which stated, "A person must give full and informed consent before being used as a subject." MKUltra scientists trampled that code constantly and remorselessly, in ways that stupefy the imagination. Their work encompassed everything from electronic brain stimulation to sensory deprivation to quote-unquote induced pain and psychosis. They sought ways to cause heart attacks, severe twitching, and intense cluster headaches. If drugs didn't do the trick, then they tried to master ESP, ultrasonic vibrations, and radiation poisoning. One project tried to harness the power of magnetic fields. Operated on a strict need-to-know basis, MKUltra was so highly classified that when John McCone succeeded Dulles as the CIA director in late 1961, he was not informed of its existence. Fewer than half a dozen agency brass were aware of MKUltra at any period during its 20-year history. When Gottlieb retired in 1972 or 73, the project retired with him. By then, it had been pared down to almost nothing, as the agency focused on other ways to halt communism and sway policy making abroad and at home. Still, when the Watergate scandal and the CIA's involvement in it consumed the nation in the early 70s, it occurred to the CIA leadership that it would be prudent to cover their tracks. Director Richard Helms ordered Gottlieb to destroy all MKUltra files. In January of 1973, The technical services staff shredded countless documents describing the use of hallucinogens, including every known copy of a manual called LSD, Some Unpsychedelic Implications. MKUltra evaporated. In their haste to purge their misdeeds, the agents forgot about a stash of some 16,000 additional papers in an offsite warehouse. Even internally, those files would remain undiscovered for several years, but it was only a matter of time until the story broke. MKUltra became fodder for rumors around Washington. In December of 1974, the project finally came to light in a terrific flash of headlines and intrigue. Seymour Hersh reported it on the front page of the New York Times. Huge CIA operation reported in U.S. against anti-war forces. 3 government investigations followed, all hobbled by the CIA's destruction of its files. When the records were available, they were redacted. When witnesses were summoned, they were forgetful. In 1975, the Church Commission was formed. The Church Commission was a U.S. Senate Select Committee that investigated abuses by the CIA, FBI, NSA, and IRS. The Church Committee's final report unveiled a 1957 internal evaluation of MKUltra by the CIA's Inspector General. Precautions must be taken, the document warned, to conceal these activities from the American public in general. The knowledge that the agency is engaging in unethical and illicit activities would have serious repercussions. Later on, a 1963 review from the Inspector General put it even more gravely. A final phase of the testing of MKUltra products places the rights and interests of U.S. citizens in jeopardy. In fact, as the Church Committee's report went on, MKUltra had caused the deaths of at least 2 American citizens. One was a psychiatric patient who'd been injected with a synthetic psychedelic. The other was Frank Olson, a CIA-contracted scientist who'd been unwittingly dosed with LSD at a small agency gathering in the backwoods of Maryland, presided by Gottlieb himself. Olson fell into an irreparable depression afterward. This depression led him to hurl himself out of the window of a New York City hotel. Olson had been brought to this hotel by other agents for quote-unquote treatment. A continued investigation by Olson's son Eric strongly suggests that the CIA arranged for agents to fake his suicide. They threw him out the window themselves out of fear that he would blow the whistle on MKUltra and the military's use of biological weapons in the Korean War. The news of Olson's death shocked a nation already reeling from Watergate, a nation already less inclined than ever to trust its institutions. The government tried to quell the controversy by passing new regulations on human experimentation, but scrutiny and internal pressure on the CIA continued to mount. The pressure got to a point where the CIA was forced to make an admission. It hadn't destroyed everything. It had come to their attention that thousands of pages about MKUltra were collecting dust in the off-site warehouse. And so came another congressional investigation more robust than the last, with 16,000 additional pages of documentation at its disposal. Senators Ted Kennedy and Daniel Inouye subpoenaed a number of CIA spooks. Among them was Gottlieb, rousted from his retirement in California and forced to defend his actions before the Senate. Or, rather, before some of the Senate. Gottlieb claimed that his heart condition precluded the possibility of his addressing the whole chamber. Instead, he was installed in a smaller room, where he answered questions from a select group while the masses listened over a public address system. As the New York Times pointed out, Gottlieb managed to elude the lights and microphones and the crush of reporters waiting for him in the Senate hearing room. He was spared the sight of the incredulity that spread over their faces as he admitted that he had destroyed MKUltra's files not to cover up quote-unquote illegal activity, but quote-unquote because this material was sensitive and capable of being misunderstood. Gottlieb resented the harm done to his reputation, and he was loath to provide specifics about MKUltra experiments, saying that he'd never witnessed any himself. Gottlieb's destruction of the MKUltra files was a federal crime. It was investigated by the Justice Department in 1976, but according to the Times, quietly dropped. His brutal courses of experimentation broke any number of laws, but he was never prosecuted. He testified before the Senate only under the condition that he'd receive total criminal immunity. As for those 16,000 new pages, they were mainly financial records, but a few more tantalizing documents found the CIA explicating its ambitions. Can we obtain control of the future activities, physical and mental, of any individual willing or unwilling, with a guarantee of amnesia, they asked. Can we force an individual to act against his own moral concepts? And can an individual be made to perform an act of attempted assassination? Senate investigators condemned MKUltra unanimously. Kennedy branded it perverse and corrupt, an erosion of the freedom of individuals and institutions in the name of national security. Inouye called it grandiose and sinister. The CIA's new director, Stansfield Turner, swore that he'd sent all existing MKUltra files to the Justice Department, which would mount a thorough investigation. But still, between the destruction of records and the subpoenaed agents' sudden memory lapses, everyone knew that the full facts may never come out. The Senate demanded the formation of a federal program to locate the victims of MKUltra experiments and to pursue criminal charges against the perpetrators. That program never coalesced. Surviving records named 80 institutions, including 44 universities and colleges, and 185 researchers, among them Louis J. West. The New York Times identified him in a front-page lead story no less as one of 7 suspected scientists who'd secretly participated in MKUltra under academic cover. And yet, not one researcher was ever federally investigated, and only 2 victims were ever notified. The Times had called MKUltra a secret 25-year, $25 million effort by the CIA to learn how to control the human mind. But it looked like no one would suffer any consequences for it. Griffin Bell, the Attorney General at the time of the revelations, told me the files never arrived at the Justice Department, despite Stansfield Turner's sworn claim to the contrary. Bell said they must have just fallen through the cracks. As for Turner himself, he told me he could no longer remember having testified that the CIA sent the files. I'm just drawing a total blank here, he said. I read his remarks back to him. I guess I did testify about this, he replied. Somebody fed me the stuff and I played it back. In any case, the New York Times ran 27 stories on MKUltra, 8 on the front page. But no one in the press corps and none of the senators involved followed up to see that the promised investigations took place. Since then, the program's bewildering significance has been engulfed many times over by other controversies. Receding in the rearview mirror, MKUltra looks like just another example of the CIA's megalomania at the zenith of the Cold War. End quote. As mentioned, I am making a longer video about Charles Manson and MKUltra. In the meantime, let's go over some more information about Manson, LSD, and the Manson trials. The following is Manson killer Leslie Van Houten on LSD.
When I first met him, he was kind of upset that I was there because I had been with a friend of his and he was frightened that my being or staying at the ranch would come between him and this other fellow. But on the whole, he was a very dominant person. Sometimes he was nice and sometimes he wasn't. More than anything else, though, he was the only one that any of us ever felt knew that he knew what he was doing. And when we would take the acid, we would take it with a lot of us together, and then he would speak to us and move with his gestures, and more or less, he never told us, that was one of his things. He always made sure to never tell us anything. He would suggest things.
Manson always made sure to never tell us anything. He would suggest things. That is exactly how LSD and mind control work. LSD is a powerful hallucinogenic drug. It has been proven that when someone is under the influence of LSD, aka acid, it's possible to permanently influence someone's thought patterns by suggesting things to them. The following is from drug researcher Charles Fisher regarding how someone under the influence of LSD can be manipulated, brainwashed into committing violence. Quote, "You can tell somebody to hurt somebody, but you can call it something else. Hammer the nail into the wood. The wood, perhaps, is a human being. It could result in some violent activity, even though LSD was considered a love drug." End quote. Charles Manson's control over his followers was largely based on this model. He would frequently give his followers LSD. Then, while his followers were under the influence, Manson would repeatedly suggest things to them over and over and over again. This method of brainwashing people by LSD and repeated suggestions was studied by the CIA. In other words, Manson's LSD brainwashing techniques were the same as the CIA's. Momentarily, I'm going to read to you a quote from Tom O'Neill's book Chaos, where he examines the Manson trials of the early 70s and how prevalent the subject of LSD was during those trials. As a matter of fact, it was even suggested during the trials that the Manson girls shouldn't get the death sentence because they were brainwashed. If you haven't yet read his book Chaos, I highly recommend picking up a copy. Quote, "After 7 grueling months, the first phase of the trial drew to a close, and the jury, after 10 days of deliberation, arrived at unanimous guilty verdicts. Now, in the second phase, the prosecution had to present an argument for putting the defendants to death. The prosecution's case and the defense's counter-arguments led to some of the most unnerving testimony yet, including a kind of symposium on LSD, not as a recreational drug, but as an agent of mind control. This death penalty phase of the trial entertained some of the same questions that engrossed and vexed me for the next 2 decades as I wrote this book. Had Charles Manson really brainwashed people? And if so, how? And if one person was truly under the psychological control of another, then who was responsible for that person's actions? For the first time, the 3 convicted women, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, took the witness stand. One by one, they explained their roles in the murders, absolving Manson of any complicity and proclaiming their utter lack of remorse. The families of the victims looked on in stunned silence as the 3 Manson women described their loved ones' final moments in clinical detail. To kill someone, the women explained, was an act of love. It freed that person from the confines of their physical being. Almost unblinkingly, Susan Atkins recalled how Tex Watson had told her to murder Sharon Tate. He looked at her and said, "Kill her." And I killed her. I just stabbed her and she fell and I stabbed her again. I don't know how many times I stabbed her. When Susan was subsequently asked if she felt any animosity towards Sharon or the others, she shrugged. "I didn't know any of them. How could I have felt any emotion without knowing them?" In Susan's mind, she quote-unquote knew what she was doing was right because it felt good. Patricia Krenwinkel said she'd felt nothing when she stabbed Abigail Folger 28 times. Why? Why would she kill a woman she didn't even know? In Patricia's words, well, it's hard to explain. It was just a thought, and the thought came to be. In terms of Leslie Van Houten's remorse, or lack thereof, she told the courtroom the following. "Sorry is only a 5-letter word. It can't bring back anything. What can I feel? It's happened, she's gone." She, of course, is Rosemary LaBianca, who Leslie Van Houten helped stab 41 times. As unrepentant as the women were, Prosecutor Bugliosi had his work cut out for him when it came to securing the death penalty. Bugliosi's reasoning relied on a seeming contradiction. He'd argued during the first phase of the trial that the women were quote-unquote brainwashed zombies, that they were totally in Manson's thrall. Now he had to prove the opposite, that they were as complicit as Manson was. The defense argued that the women were merely pawns. Charles Manson had used an almost technologically precise combination of drugs, hypnotism, and coercion to transform these formerly non-violent people into frenzied, psychopathic killers. Manson, the defense argued, had used the drug to ply his impressionable followers, accessing their innermost chambers of their minds and molding them to his designs. Former members of the Manson family have often recounted Manson's systematic brainwashing methods, beginning with the seduction of new recruits. He'd seduct them by quote-unquote bombarding them with love, sex, and drugs. Former Manson family member Paul Watkins, the near-weekly orgies that Manson orchestrated at the Spawn Ranch. Manson would hand out drugs, personally deciding everyone's dosages, and then, as Bugliosi writes in Helter Skelter, Charlie might dance around, everyone else following like a train. As he'd take off his clothes, all the rest would take off their clothes. Charlie would direct the orgy, arranging bodies, combinations, positions. Watkins said he'd set it all up in a beautiful way, like he was creating a masterpiece in sculpture. But instead of clay, he was using warm bodies. Again, that was from Helter Skelter. If any of those bodies had hang-ups or inhibitions, Manson would remove them. He'd force someone else to do whatever he or she was resisting. In Bugliosi's words, a 13-year-old girl's initiation into the Manson family consisted of her being sodomized by Manson while the others watched. Manson also went down on a young boy to show the others he had rid himself of all inhibitions. Having made them feel freed and wanted, Manson would isolate his followers from the world beyond the ranch, giving them daily tasks to support the commune and forbidding them from communicating with their families or friends. Manson's followers had no newspapers, clocks, or calendars. Manson would even choose new names for his followers. Susan Atkins testified the following during the trial. In order for me to be completely free in my mind, I had to be able to completely forget the past. The easiest way to do this is to change identity. Now, the induction of new members into the Manson family was complete after they participated in lengthy LSD sessions, often stretching over consecutive days with no breaks, during which Manson only pretended to take the drug, or took a much smaller dose. Clear-headed, Charles manipulated their minds with elaborate word games and sensory techniques. With only negligible downtime between acid trips, detachment was all the easier. Every LSD experience led the family to drift further from reality until eventually even basic contradictions seemed tenable. Death was the same as life, and good was no different from bad. Manson wanted to use LSD, in Paul Watkins' opinion, to quote-unquote instill his philosophies, exploit weaknesses and fears, and extract promises and agreements from his followers. It worked. Watkins recalled an instance in which Manson told Susan Atkins, "I'd like half a coconut, even if you have to go to Brazil to get it." According to Paul Watkins, Susan Atkins got right up and was on her way out the door when Charlie said, "Never mind." According to Paul, Manson excelled at locating deep-seated hang-ups. He took up residence in people's heads, leaving them with no point of reference, nothing to relate back to, no right, no wrong, no roots. They lived in a new reality summoned by LSD. Now, ironically, as his followers became more and more robotic, Manson taught them that people in the straight world were like computers. The worldview of people from the straight world was simply a matter of society's programming, and any program could be expunged. On the witness stand during the trial, Susan Atkins described Sharon Tate as a quote-unquote IBM machine. Words came out of her mouth, but they didn't make any sense to me. According to Tex Watson, one of the goals within the Manson family was to burn yourself out, to take so much LSD and listen to so much of Charlie's music that you return to a quote-unquote purity, a nothingness, resembling a new birth. This was called going quote-unquote dead in the head. It allowed you to incorporate yourself into the collective, sharing one common brain. Now, prosecutor Bugliosi argued that the Manson women had been psychologically compromised, but he didn't assert that Manson had actually created his killers. Despite Manson's talk about reprogramming, there was no known template for one person ever having quote-unquote reprogrammed another. Instead, Bugliosi purported that Manson's followers must have had some pre-existing homicidal impulse buried in their subconsciousness. According to this argument, Manson had learned to recognize and exploit that impulse, but even so, each woman was responsible for her actions. This argument fascinated and perplexed me. It posited a form of brainwashing in which the brainwashed were still, to some degree, themselves. When it came time to decide on the death penalty, however, the defense called a series of psychiatric experts who disagreed. Manson had brainwashed his followers, they said, and those followers couldn't be culpable for murder. LSD had given him a portal to their subconscious. The scientists explained how acid could break down and reconstruct someone's personality, how a sober quote-unquote guide intended to lead someone peacefully through hours of an acid trip could abuse the role, inserting violent ideals and beliefs into their minds. With repetition and reinforcement, these beliefs took root even when the followers were sober. Throw in other coercive techniques like sensory deprivation and hypnosis, both of which Manson embraced, and it was possible to rewrite someone's moral code such that she acknowledged no such thing as right or wrong. Dr. Joel Fort, a research psychiatrist who'd opened the nation's first LSD treatment center, was one of the defense witnesses. He believed that Manson had used LSD to produce a quote-unquote new pattern of behavior for the girls, resulting in a totally neutral system which saw death or killing in a completely different way than a normal person would, free of moral concern, compassion, or moral values. In one of the most remarkable exchanges in the trial, Manson's attorney, Irving Kinerick, asked Dr. Fort if a school for crime could exist, attended by social rejects and fueled by LSD. In Irving's exact words to Dr. Fort, "Let us say, with your knowledge of LSD, you have a school for crime, and then you take them here, and you program them to go out and commit a murder there." here, everywhere. Are you telling us that this can be done? That you can capture the human mind by such a school for crime? In response, Dr. Fort said, I am indeed telling you that. Dr. Fort had never seen anything like it. He compared it to a government's ability, through the nebulous power of patriotism, to condition soldiers to kill on its behalf. What no one brought up was how was it possible that someone like Manson, with little formal education and so much prison time, had mastered the ability to control people this way? Whether you thought it was full-on brainwashing or merely intense coercion, the fact remained, he'd done it. No one else had. This remains the most enduring mystery of the case. It's the one that still keeps me up at night. And while all this back and forth about LSD is provocative, it feels like an insufficient explanation. In Helter Skelter, author Bugliosi deals with this unfathomable riddle. How did Charles Manson, a barely literate ex-con, who'd spent more than half his life in federal institutions, end up turning a group of previously peaceful hippies, among them a small-town librarian, a high school football star, and a homecoming princess, into savage, unrepentant killers in less than a year? Bugliosi conceded that he still didn't have the answer. He writes the following. All these factors contributed to Manson's control over others, but when you add them up all together, do they equal murder without remorse? Maybe, but I tend to think there's something more, a missing link that enabled him to rape the minds of his killers that they would go against the most ingrained of all commandments. Thou shalt not kill, and willingly, even eagerly, murder at Manson's command. It may be something in his charismatic, enigmatic personality, some intangible quality that no one else has yet been able to isolate and identify. It may be something he learned from others. Whatever it is, I believe Manson has full knowledge of the formula he used, and it worries me that we do not. Again, that was from Helter Skelter. Now, in the end, Manson and his family got the death penalty anyway. Bugliosi said that they had coursing through their veins the willingness to kill others. For the jury, as for the public, that was a much more comfortable truth. These people, the Manson killers, were an aberration. Brainwashing, complete loss of agency, these were difficult to contemplate, let alone to accept. When you take LSD enough times, you reach a stage of nothing, Manson had said in court. You reach a stage of no thought. No one wanted to dwell on that. Ingrained evil teased out of young women by a mastermind, that was something. And something was better than a stage of nothing. It was more comfortable to believe the killers were just an aberration. When the jury delivered the death sentences to the 4 defendants, Manson, Krenwinkel, Atkins, and Van Houten, the 3 women sprang to their feet. Their heads were freshly shaved as Manson's was. They had enlarged the X's on their foreheads as Manson had, and they were livid. You have judged yourselves, Patricia Krenwinkel screamed at the jury. Better lock your doors and watch your own kids, Susan Atkins warned. Your whole system is a game, Leslie Van Houten shouted. You blind, stupid people, your children will turn against you. Out on the street, Sandy Good, one of Manson's fiercest loyalists, looked into a TV camera and said, Death? That's what you're all going to get. With all that, the Manson family was swept off the national stage. End quote. 7 people had been brutally murdered, but the nation was confident that we knew how and why, and that the evil people were behind bars. End quote. As mentioned, I am working on a longer video about Charles Manson, LSD, and the CIA. Keep an eye out for that one. Now, before wrapping up this video, I do want to touch on one more subject. In terms of hallucinations, in terms of seeing things, there was a famous instance with Sharon Tate in which she recalled seeing dead people. I have touched on this in a previous video, but for those of you who haven't heard it, essentially, Sharon Tate, 3 years before her death, had a disturbing vision. According to CieloDrive.com, on September 2nd, 1969, columnist Dick Kleiner wrote a very interesting piece about how apparently Sharon Tate told him in 1966, 3 years before her death, that she saw a vision of her body mutilated. Quote, it was just a creepy story when Sharon Tate told it to me in early 1966. But now, 3 years and several murders later, it has acquired something much more than just creepiness. Sharon was a starlet in 1966. People thought she was going to be a big star, and maybe she would have been. She was sensational to look at, but there was something a little strange about her. Everybody noticed it. People thought at the time perhaps it was because her first feature film was an oddball terror thing called Eye of the Devil. But in any case, you could look at her for hours and listen to the nutty stories coming out of that beautiful head. I like stories of the supernatural, and Sharon knew that. She had a story like that to share with me. The story involved Jay Sebring and his house in Benedict Canyon. No, not the house where Sharon and Jay were killed in 1969. That house was on Cielo Drive, just off Benedict. But those two houses can't be much more than a mile apart. Anyways, Sharon used to date Jay Sebring. This was before she met Roman Polanski. Sharon and Jay were together for years, and Jay had a house in Benedict Canyon. This house was once owned by Paul Byrne, a director, writer, and producer for MGM. On September 5th, 1932, Paul Byrne commits suicide in this house. Sharon calmly told me this story. Now, at some point in Sharon's relationship with Jay Sebring, it seems that Jay was in New York on business, and Sharon was in between apartments. She called Jay and asked if she could stay in his house. Of course she could. That night at the house, that dark night, she was alone. Sharon wasn't usually spooked, but for some reason that night in the house, she was. She kept a light on by the side of her bed. Sharon told me, "I saw a creepy little man. He looked like the pictures I'd seen of Paul Byrne." Sharon ran downstairs. When she got downstairs, she wished she was still upstairs. "I saw a vision of someone tied to the staircase," she said. "It might have been me. It might have been Jay, but whoever it was, this body was cut open at the throat." Sharon needed a drink to calm her nerves. She eventually found the house bar, and there was some wallpaper by that bar. For some reason, Sharon picked away at the wallpaper and tore it down. Strange how the mind works. Worrying about wallpaper when ghosts are wandering around upstairs and mutilated bodies are tied to the staircase downstairs. Sharon thought it must have been a dream. She decided to find out and went back upstairs. According to Sharon, the mutilated body was still tied to the stairs. Could it have been her body or Jay's body? And that creepy little man was still prowling around upstairs. But Sharon went back to bed and somehow slept. When Jay Sebring came back the next morning, he woke her up. She remembered the events of the night before, but it must have been a dream. However, according to Sharon, Jay called out, "Hey, who tore the wallpaper off by the bar down here?" That part, at least, was not a dream. 3 years later, a mile up the road, there was a nightmare. Sharon, Jay, and 3 others, 4 if you include Sharon's unborn child, were all killed.